Alright, so here is the quick presentation on the European Renaissance. This is going to be focused specifically on the Italian Renaissance. You need to follow along, take notes in your notebook. This will be checked by me in class. And please make sure if you are confused about anything and need to rewatch it, go ahead and rewind and rewatch. This is the European Renaissance, and we're talking about a time that is a radical change in Europe. It really ushers in a dramatic social and cultural changes in Europe. The birthplace of the Renaissance is Italy. There's several reasons for this. We looked at a couple in class the other day, and we're going to continue to look at some of that today. So anyway, the Renaissance was an explosion of creativity in art, writing, and thought. It started in northern Italy from about the 1300s to the 1600s. And their purpose was to revive the past and create something new. So there's a huge change in the innovation of styles of art and literature. There's a huge new value on the importance of the individual, which we'll talk about here in a minute, and humanism. Now, a lot of people ask why this occurred in Italy. It really thrived in Italy because of the city-states. Okay, now these are small little states that have their own government, have their own economies, and they really thrive because of the Crusades. When people went off to the Crusades, they gathered a lot of materials, they came back to Italy and traded. And this gave the Italians a big advantage because they had a monopoly on a lot of the trade. So this growth of the city-states in northern Italy was very important. Italy was also very urban compared to the rest of Europe, while Europe was very rural. All right, most people were still living in farms and things like that in the rest of Europe. While in Italy, cities were getting more and more people. There was enough food for everybody to eat, so people could start concentrating on other kinds of businesses and adventures. Anyway, and also in the 1300s, the bubonic plague killed about 60% of the population, which disrupted a lot of the economy. So there was very few laborers, and they could demand much higher wages. And since there were few job opportunities, they began to pursue other interests such as art. So this change in the economy really drove this new idea of art in Italy. One of the biggest patrons of the arts were the Medicis. Okay, this is a family, a banking family that developed in Florence, and they're these wealthy merchant class that develops. They don't inherit their social rank like the traditionally been passed down from father to son, father to son. These are people who actually pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, by their business sense, and they made their own money. So they believed they deserved this power and wealth because of their individual merit and involvement in politics. So this is where the change starts to come in. Instead of people are put in their spot, and more the thought that people actually can change their position and make themselves better. So more emphasis is put on the individual and the achievement. Many banking families rose, such as the Medicis, who control Florence. Now, the Renaissance is the idea of rebirth. That's the term Renaissance, is rebirth. And when we're talking about rebirth, it's really the rebirth of the classical heritage and knowledge of the Greeks and Romans. The artists and scholars, they start studying the ruins of Rome. They start studying Latin and Greek manuscripts. In addition, scholars moved to Rome after the fall of Constantinople, and with them they bring a huge wealth of knowledge, plus pretty much a library that they can start translating into local vernacular and languages. Now, this study of all these different classical knowledge, the Greeks and the Romans, led to something called humanism, and this was an intellectual movement that focused on human achievements. Now, as we just discussed with the Medicis, they brought themselves up. So it's the idea that people are focused on themselves. How can we achieve greatness as opposed to how can we achieve greatness for God? All right, so humanists studied classical texts, history, literature, and philosophy. Also during this time, there's more of a focus on the pursuit of worldly pleasures. I remember during the medieval times, the church really dominated every kind of facet of life. Okay, you lived and you toiled in your feudal pyramid so that you could go to heaven. Now in the Renaissance, people thought it was okay to have fun. All right, Renaissance society was way more secular, and a secular place is somewhere where there's a separation between church and life. Okay, so it's worldly rather than spiritual, and they're concerned with the here and now as opposed to the afterlife. So humanists suggest that a person could enjoy life without offending God. And a lot of the wealthy, they were extravagant with their wealth. They bought fine food and clothes and had beautiful homes and palaces. And this is the first time that people thought it was okay to really display that wealth as a display of power. They're also patrons of the arts. Now, the Medicis were the most well-known patrons of the arts, and these are the financial supporters of the artists. All right, they had enough money that they could spend this on art. All right, which was not a necessity back then, but this is the first time that people could really raise money and had enough money to spend purely on art. So church leaders also spent money on artwork to beautify a lot of cities. Wealthy merchants were also patrons of the arts, thus they demonstrated their importance. All right, so if you had or paid for more art, you were obviously wealthier and had more importance in the city. During this time, the idea of a Renaissance man came about. And this is the idea that you could be very well-rounded in all sorts of things. Okay, all educated people were expected to create art. All wealthy people were expected to be educated and therefore create art as well. All right, so the ideal individual in the Renaissance man strove to master almost every area of study: the classics, art, politics, combat, etc. All right, a man who excelled in many of these fields was praised as the universal man, or later known as the Renaissance man. One author wrote about this in The Courtier. The author's name was Baldassare Castiglione in 1528, and he wrote The Courtier and said, "This is how you become such a person as a Renaissance man, that they should be charming and witty and well educated in the classics. They should dance, sing, play music, and write poetry. And they should also be a skilled writer, wrestler, and swordsman." Now, it's pretty difficult to be all these things in one, but people strive to become these kinds of things. Now, that was a big difference from the Renaissance women. Now, Renaissance men were encouraged to do all these different things. Women, on the other hand, were not pressured into becoming these sportsmen and things like that. The upper class women should also know the classics and be charming, but are not expected to seek fame. They weren't supposed to create art. They're only supposed to inspire it. So they're really supposed to be beautiful and quiet. They had little influence in politics. One exception was Isabella d'Este, who was a patron of art and wields a lot of power in Mantua, which was a state in northern Italy. Now, art changed a whole lot during the Renaissance. The change in style, they started using a more realistic style where they copied from classical art, and they often portray religious subjects. This is specific to Italy. Now, when we move to the northern Renaissance, you'll see that art changes a little bit in a different way. Okay? Painters also, almost for the first time, start using what is called perspective. Right? It's a way to show 3 dimensions on canvas. Before, in the Middle Ages, everybody was on the same level. In these Renaissance paintings, and we'll take a look at a couple in class, there's more perspective. You could see smaller images in the background that showed that they were far away, as opposed to the images close in the foreground. Some really important artists came out at this time. Michelangelo, he creates realistic portraits of prominent citizens. He was also a very famous sculptor and architect. Sculpture was showed natural postures and expressions, and Donatello was one of the famous artists that did that. And then the biblical David was one of the favorite subjects among a lot of sculptors. Excuse me. Leonardo da Vinci is probably the best-known Renaissance man. He was a painter, sculptor, inventor, scientist. He was a biologist. He did a whole lot of things. He paints one of the best-known portraits in the world, which is the Mona Lisa, still to this day very famous, as well as The Last Supper. Raphael advances realism. His name was Raphael Sanzio. He is famous for his use in perspective. His favorite subject was the Madonna and the Child, and his most famous painting is the School of Athens. And we'll take a look at that in class, women as well. Okay. Not only did art change, but literature as well. The works that finally start to reflect their time, they start using vernacular as opposed to Latin. All right, so when I say vernacular, I mean Italian, German, French, Spanish, English. That's vernacular. Okay. The objective was for self-expression or for a portrayal of individuality and subject. 2 famous writers at this time are Petrarch and Boccaccio. Petrarch was a humanist and a poet, and he had a woman named Laura that he used as his muse. And Boccaccio is best known for the Decameron, a series of stories. Niccolo Machiavelli wrote a political guidebook called The Prince, and in it he examined how rulers can gain and keep power in spite of their enemies. A prince must be strong as a lion, shrewd as a fox. He may have to trick others for the good of the state. Machiavelli really approved of absolutism, of the idea that one person should rule everybody else, and we'll look into this more in detail when we get a little bit further on in history.